again, from the Veros and a risk-wire standpoint, we'll continue to push this information out through webinars and through materials. A question came in earlier as far as the site for the paper that we have identified before. We'll make sure that we can push that out through an email to any of the registered participants on this webinar today. And this deck and other information that comes about, as long as you're on our email list, we can we'll plan on pushing that information out. But it's a steady conversation. It's a conversation that we need to discuss openly and get different interpretations to truly understand what takes place. UMDP, we have identified the dates, and those are coming quickly. And as Sue has just identified, lenders and vendors need to be moving on these things immediately. So with that and with those comments, we'll move toward some of the questions. And the first question that I have that came up in front of me is related to the interagency guideline. John, I'll push this question towards you, and it reads, there's been a lot of talk about average condition. What does average mean?
Well, I think the answer is kind of in the question. I'm not really a big fan of average condition. It's a very subjective umbrella type of term. It definitely has different meanings depending on what geography you're in and the person who's evaluating the property. This average condition, poor condition, or good or fair condition would be used if you adopt a solution that involves a visual inspection. I would recommend really focusing on key physical attributes of the property and the neighborhood rather than one person's assessment on what is quote-unquote average condition. There's a lot more to be said if is the roof intact? Is the siding damaged on the house? Is the house sitting next to a chemical plant or next to the railroad tracks? Things that will affect marketability and the value of the property. And the lender needs to define policies around these attributes or conditions. So I would recommend staying away from some of those umbrella terms if you're going to adopt a solution that's going to involve the inspection.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments?
I think this is Bill King. I think one of the key things is that within the body of the document, the interagency guidelines, although they use the term average, the key is that it says that you are not to assume condition. And I think a lot of the intent here is that some folks, I think, have assumed that all properties are in like condition, and so there's a sort of a flat view of the condition of property when applying these technological tools. And the key word here, I think, is that they are not to assume the condition.
I'll chime in a little bit there. Lee Kennedy here. Models don't assume condition. It's either a proxy for condition within the model, but I think models generally that I've seen through testing either consider all the properties equal, therefore there's no adjustment, there's no weighted adjustment within the algorithm. I think it was just a poorly worded section there, or a misunderstanding of how models actually look at the properties.
Excellent point, Lee. Thank you.
Hey, Lee, we'll stick with you. Another question that came in, and we've heard this question many times, again with the interagency guidelines. What is the date the new guidance became effective, and is there an extension as rumored?
Yeah, I haven't heard about the rumor, and I haven't been able to find anything about a rumor or anything in print out there on that, but it's a question I get from my clients as well. And basically what I do is refer them to the guidance itself. There's a section in the guidance that provides for a transition from your existing policies and procedures into the new guidance, and it's under Section 2, Final Interagency Guidelines. And basically what it says is the guidelines are effective upon publication in the Federal Register, and that happened on December 10th, as we all know. However, on a case-by-case basis, an institution needing to improve its appraisal and evaluation program may be granted some flexibility from its primary federal regulator on the time frame for revising its procedures to be consistent with the guidelines. This time frame should be consummate with the level and nature of the institution's real estate lending activity. So the way I read that is basically the only question in there is what is a reasonable time frame. And I'll go back to this again. Only your regulator can answer that for you. So, get a hold of your primary regulator. My suggestion is you keep on track with the guidance that you already have received from your regulators. Get that implemented if you're in that process. That should satisfy 98% of this guidance. That hasn't really changed. It's just basically taken all the previous guidance and coalesced it into the new guidance. So you should be in good shape there. And again, the only remaining question, that 2% question, is centered around the evaluation content at the actual physical property condition piece.
Okay, any other comments? Sue, we have a question that came in for you. It says, what part of the interim final rule or interagency guidelines has led Sue to believe AVMs can be used?
Well, that's a great question. They can be used for certain things and not used for other things. It's very clear that they can't be used for origination decisions on federally related transactions, and that's not new. We've not ever been able to use them really unless back in the day, we were able to use them on origination of some loans for portfolio product and with the secondary and investor approval. But these days, we're not using them for loan origination of any federally related transactions. What we are using them for is our due diligence, our QC, and some marketing work and portfolio analysis. What led me to believe that I could use them is that the rule doesn't say that I can't use them. And in fact, it clearly defines how I can use them, what kind of due diligence and testing I need to do to support the use. So I think it's pretty clear that they can be used. You just have to be and pay very close attention to not using them as a sole decision in the origination of a loan. You can't use an AVM to decide on a value for a federally related transaction. That's very clear. But I certainly can build in tolerances around AVMs and models that would be used. And remember, too, that models aren't just for generating values. We're using models to understand fraud, to understand market trends, to understand all kinds of practices and concepts, and even for predicting where we might hit the bottom of the trough on some of our jumbo products. Anytime you use a model, for whatever reason, it has to be tested. You have to understand it, and it has to be used responsibly. But use a model as a sole determinant of a value conclusion for a federally related transaction, no way. Not going to happen.
And just to clarify that, Sue, by federally related transaction, you're talking de minimis 250 and above, correct?
Correct. Or the GSEs, to meet investor requirements. The investors don't allow it either. So federally related transaction, the person or the entity that's actually lending the money says no, you can't. But if you do, you have to follow very clearly the outline in the guidelines on how to use them and how to maintain them.
Yeah, and there's other restrictions as well as the high cost loans and some other restrictions along those lines. Yeah.
Sure. But you should be using them where you can.
Okay, another follow-up question, and similar, reads, do I understand correctly that the interagency guidelines has more to do with how a lender is required to use property valuations, AVM versus BPO versus appraisal, as part of their lending practices, rather than how an AVM is designed?
Yeah, Bill King here. I would say basically the answer to that is yes, and I think that part of what we need to consider in looking at these different options is how they are, how they're defined, and what the expectations are when different tools are used. And we've got the umbrella concept of valuation, and I think it's worth noting that in the interagency guidelines, the term appraiser was replaced with persons preparing valuations, with the idea that valuations encompass both appraisal and evaluations. And likewise, valuation was inserted to replace appraisal, and again for the same reason. And I bring that up because as we look at the concept, and this question introduces BPOs, which we haven't talked about a great deal here, but again, a BPO is not by itself an appraisal or an evaluation, but the guidelines do say that they can be used for monitoring collateral value in an existing loan. The key reason that the BPO is not considered an appraisal or evaluation is because the pursuit is a price pursuit rather than a market value pursuit. And so that's a key difference there. So as a consequence, the interagency guidelines do go into a lot of detail about the various circumstances in which different techniques can be employed.
Any other comments?
Well, who's the audience for the interagency guideline? Is a question. I mean, who's the audience? It's directed at who?
Lenders.
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 So the answer is yes. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Okay, another follow-up to that. In a portfolio review management process, can you use an AVM without an update or knowledge of the property condition?
Well, absolutely. And again, I think, absolutely. This is one of those situations where, you know, as has been previously pointed out, this would not meet the definition of a federally related transaction. There's not an extension of new credit. There's not an interaction directly with a borrower or a consumer. This is strictly an internal process for a lender to understand better the quality of the portfolio that they have.
Well, absolutely, but I'd also like to add that some kind of random sampling whenever a portfolio analysis is done, regardless of how many loans you're looking at, whether you're looking at 100 or tens of thousands of loans in a portfolio and going through that analysis, needs to have some kind of random sampling where a field, somebody actually takes a handful, goes out into the field, and actually verifies that the properties exist, or does some kind of actual physical sampling at some point in the process. I think it's irresponsible to do any kind of a portfolio analysis just straight across the board using automation totally and completely.